Look at the British Isles today, and you see a relatively small nation anchored off the coast of Europe. Yet a little over a century ago, this isolated rocky landmass commanded the largest empire in human history. Today, the British government holds power over just 14 scattered overseas territories, but at its peak in 1921, its borders enveloped a full quarter of the globe's landmass and governed almost a third of the world's population. That massive footprint did not happen smoothly. The earliest attempts at expansion were absolute disasters. English colonists famously vanished without a trace at Roanoke, and a late 1600s Scottish attempt to colonize Panama, the Darien Scheme, collapsed entirely under the weight of tropical disease and Spanish attacks. The failure in Panama cost nearly a fifth of Scotland's total wealth. Facing financial ruin, the kingdom entered a formal union with England in 1707, creating the single state of Great Britain.
This unification changed the nature of British expansion. Colonization shifted from royal vanity projects into a series of corporate joint stock ventures, where military power was used to secure returns for private shareholders. Armed with this corporate strategy, Britain launched a massive push into North America and the Caribbean throughout the 17th century. To turn a profit, they needed cheap labor for their sugar plantations. The Crown chartered the Royal African Company, which quickly monopolized the brutal, immensely lucrative transatlantic slave trade, flooding the colonies with forced labor. The wealth poured in, but London tightly controlled the purse strings. When Parliament began taxing the American colonies without giving them political representation, the settlers revolted. After an 8-year war, Britain was forced to recognize the independence of the United States. Losing their most valuable real estate could have crippled them. Instead, it acted as a harsh corrective. Britain quickly cut its losses in the West and pivoted its entire colonial machinery toward the largely untapped markets of Asia and the Pacific. To replace the lost American territories, Britain followed the maps of explorers like Captain James Cook to the eastern coast of Australia, establishing new outposts and using the continent as a massive penal settlement. Further north, the British East India Company acted as the empire's new corporate vanguard. Using its own private armies, the company systematically wrestled control of the Indian subcontinent away from French rivals and local rulers. This aggressive corporate governance eventually hit a breaking point. In 1857, local troops violently mutinied against their British corporate commanders in a bloody conflict known as the Sepoy Rebellion. Realizing a private company could no longer handle the logistics of an entire subcontinent, the British government dissolved the East India Company. Parliament assumed direct, absolute rule, transforming India into a formal state possession, the undisputed jewel in the imperial crown. Back at home, the Industrial Revolution was booming. British merchants shifted focus from slave-produced agricultural goods to domestic manufacturing, and growing political pressure eventually forced Parliament to abolish the slave trade entirely. To protect their new export routes, they needed absolute control of the oceans. A crushing victory over the French and Spanish navies at Trafalgar in 1805 secured British maritime supremacy for the next century and a half. They leveraged that naval power to occupy Egypt and carve up vast stretches of the African continent. Controlling the newly built Suez Canal allowed them to drastically cut the travel time between the Mediterranean and their crucial markets in the Indian Ocean. This map shows the All Red Line, a massive network of underwater telegraph cables completed in 1902. By physically wiring their territories together, London could synchronize trade and direct resources across continents in real time. Information that once took months by ship now arrived in hours. This allowed the British government to adopt the role of a global policeman, exerting economic and military pressure on sovereign nations like China and Argentina whenever their commercial interests were threatened. By 1900, the combination of telegraph-linked ports, naval dominance, and the taxation of goods passing through British-controlled waters gave London financial influence over nearly every major trade route on the planet. When the First World War broke out, Britain relied heavily on its overseas territories. Over 2.5 million men from India, Canada, Australia, and other colonies were sent into the trenches to secure a victory that ultimately absorbed the remains of the German and Ottoman empires. The territorial map had never looked larger, but the treasury was empty. The cost of 2 world wars left Britain without the resources to support its overstretched colonies or suppress the growing independence movements that followed. a rapid dismantling swept across the globe. Throughout the mid-20th century, dozens of colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia successfully negotiated or fought for their right to self-governance. 400 years of imperial expansion effectively closed in 1997, when British officials formally lowered their flag and handed control of Hong Kong back to China. The empire dissolved, but its wake shaped the modern world. Britain exported its language, legal structures, and culture across the globe. Today, the isolated island that started it all has become a multicultural hub, populated by the descendants of the very people it once conquered.